One of the most perplexing things about Chinese society is that despite the lack of freedom and democracy, many people in China actually actively prefer the political system in their own country over the one in the West. So perplexing in fact that people have tried to come up with all sorts of reasonings as to why people in China love their government so much. From reasons such as, oh, Chinese people actually secretly hate their government, they just can't say it, to explanations like, they're all brainwashed, so it can't be helped. However, the truth is that these are simply lazy answers that people give to pretend like they know what they're talking about without even trying to understand the complex dynamics of Chinese politics. And in my opinion, it's not just a disservice to understanding China as a whole, but also a disservice to yourself in growing your understanding of the world. What will be really shocking for a lot of people to hear is that polling data has actually shown that a large number of Chinese people actually see their country as democratic, with 83% claiming that China is a democratic nation, a number that is higher than countries like the United States, France, and the UK. This data, by the way, was compiled and surveyed by the Alliance Democracies Foundation, which is a non-profit organization founded in Denmark by the former NATO Secretary General and former Danish Prime Minister, and it's considered to be one of the largest studies on democracy. So please understand that this isn't some number that the Chinese government came up with. In fact, this finding is actually rather very consistent with other academic works that have been published about Chinese people's perception of its government over the years. A 2020 Harvard study found that Chinese people's positive perception of their government has actually increased each year across the board, with poor marginalized group even more likely to be satisfied with the government. There are a couple of things that are happening here that makes the average Chinese person believe that their country is democratic. First is the Chinese word for democracy, which literally translates to country led by the people. There are 98 million members in the Communist Party of China. To put this into perspective, the Communist Party of China alone has a membership which is around 4 times that of the population of Australia. The members of the party come from all sorts of socio-economic backgrounds, wielding different levels of political power and influence. Because of this, many Chinese people feel that anyone can, in theory, join the government and contribute to making a difference for their country so long as they put the effort to join, which is why they consider their country to be democratic. Now, whether all these reasons are actually true in practice is up for debate, but this isn't really what this video is about. Rather, it's about trying to understand why Chinese people think this way. The second reason is that in China, people do not necessarily equate democracy to voting like we do here in the West. Instead, for China, democracy simply is whether or not the government is fulfilling the will of the people in the country. And this mostly manifests itself in form of economic growth and prosperity, which is something that most everyone around the world, but especially the Chinese, value. In fact, you could argue that for most of the average Chinese people, they've actually gained more freedom under the dictatorship. This is precisely because of the economic prosperity that the country has experienced over the past few decades. More Chinese people are now able to freely travel out of the country to go on nice vacations. More people are now able to freely pick the type of restaurants and food that they want to indulge in. More people are now able to freely pursue the type of education that they want. More people are now able to freely pick the type of car they want to drive and freely pick the place that they want to live in. The average Chinese person now has the ability to much more freely climb the social ladder and chase dreams of prosperity. Everything I just listed was something that was really hard to come by even few generations ago in the past. After all, what is the point of living in a free country if you don't have the economic prosperity to use that freedom to do things you enjoy doing? We often forget that even 2 generations ago, China used to be a backwater nation that was ravaged by internal and external conflict. It's true that the average Chinese person might not necessarily have the freedom that people in the West might have, but this is completely irrelevant when you consider where China was in the past. And even though it might seem difficult to understand at first, when you think about it, it's really not that different from the way that some Americans might feel. In fact, the reason I gave for why Chinese people believe that their country is democratic is actually also the reason for why some Americans are increasingly believing that America is not a democratic nation. Because many Americans don't feel that the government is responsive to the will of the people, even if the leaders are voted and elected in. Essentially, some people are increasingly believing that voting is useless. This critique of democracy has also been alluded by President Xi Jinping himself, who also even took a slight jab at American democratic process. Now, personally, I disagree with this assessment, and I am considering eventually releasing a separate video talking about the United States and why America is still a fantastic place and isn't actually as bad as people, specifically those who live in the country, think it is. However, I'm just using this example so that you can understand why Chinese people might feel this way, which is the point of this video. According to Freedom House report, in 2023, China ranks lower in freedom than Gaza Strip, which actually goes to my next point, which is that when we think about the concept of freedom in China, it's important to acknowledge that there is also an absolute over-exaggeration of how little freedom exists in China that is often parroted here in the West, largely fueled by emerging Cold War. For example, according to CSIS report, Chinese people are actually surprisingly more vocal about their political outlook than people in the West give them credit for, with opinions more diverse than expected, showing once again how complicated on-the-ground reality of China's political discourse is. The perfect example of an over-exaggerated claims of oppression and lack of freedom in China is the idea of social credit score, which is a supposed system that exists to control people's behavior in China, where if a citizen in China says or does something that the Chinese government doesn't like, you can get social points deducted, which would cause you to be denied access to services in the country. Essentially, an Orwellian system used to control people's thoughts and behavior. Yet the existence of such system in the way that people think have been widely pushed back by academics and journalists, with many claims even outright debunked. In fact, there are so many articles and great YouTube videos on this that I am surprised at how frequently it is still parroted even to this day. To quote MIT Technology Review, contrary to popular belief, there is no central social credit score for individuals, and frankly, the Chinese central government has never talked about wanting one. As academic Vincent Bruss pointed out, hundreds of headlines have discussed the system, but few have systematically broken down what the social credit system is and how it works. Some studies refer to the breathtaking ambitions of the system and the massive quantities of behavior data going into the system without substantiating these claims in any way. Others rely on assumptions of what the system will look like, erroneously speculating that everyone will receive a social credit score, that this score will be publicly available, and that a bad rating will have far-reaching consequences. It is like a game of Chinese whispers gone wrong. Another thing that is greatly over-exaggerated is the supposed lack of freedom to protest in China. There is this idea within Western consciousness that protests in China are extremely rare and that you can get into serious trouble for it. But this has also been pushed back by some academics and journalists as well. Here is an Atlantic article back in 2012 talking about how China remains stable despite having almost 500 protests a day, with 180,000 protests, riots, and mass demonstrations in 2010 alone, and actual concessions from the government, which the article pointed out. Now, the Atlantic article does interpret all this in a negative way, essentially making the argument that this is all just a surface level compromise and that democracy is still the only way for Chinese people to truly be happy. But the point here is that Chinese people do actually protest and do actually make concessions from the government. In fact, in the paper Government in Opposition, a peer-reviewed academic journal published in Cambridge University Press, written by assistant professor Li Yao, has argued that the idea that Chinese people are brutally repressed for any kind of political action isn't actually supported by evidence at all, and that although the scope of protest is limited compared to democracies, that the situation on the ground is way more nuanced. Now, this finding shouldn't be that surprising if you have been paying attention. Probably the funniest example of Chinese protest is the idea of nail house. Nail houses are when a Chinese person refuses to sell their home as a protest against new constructions by the government. Because of this, oftentimes the government will have to build roads and infrastructure around the houses. I'm sure you've seen photos or videos like these on the internet before. Now take a moment to question yourself, how could something like this possibly happen if the Chinese government could truly do whatever it wants forcefully to its citizens without considering their will? That's not to say that the usage of force by the government has never happened before, but the more you look into it, the more you realize that the social contract between the government and its citizen in China are far more complicated than people looking from the outside like to admit. Another recent and much more significant example is the mass protest that happened against the draconian lockdown that happened in China during COVID-19. In Western press, this was depicted as Chinese citizens finally standing up to the authoritarian rules of China and that this is the end for the Chinese government. It was a massive news here in the West. Yet it's seldom acknowledged that right after this protest happened, the Chinese government actually responded to the request of the people by completely removing the lockdown altogether. And even if it is acknowledged, it's twisted in a way where it's interpreted as the Chinese government reluctantly having to do so, showing signs of weaknesses. Yet if you were actually aware of the Chinese perception of this event at the time, you will know that this move was seen extremely positively by the Chinese people, and another sign that the government exists to respond to the people's request, affirming to the people living in the country once again that the government will always be there if the people truly demands it. Now, this is usually the part of the video where someone will be furiously typing in the comment section bringing up historical events in China that contradict this, but understand that these events you're referring to are historical exceptions. Every time some kind of news about a protest happening in China comes on, I see more people on internet forums salivating at the idea of another Tiananmen Square event than something like this actually happening. Now, I want to take a moment to once again tell you that this isn't a segment about why everything is actually rainbows and sunshine in China. The point isn't that they actually have a lot of freedom similar to that of Western democracies. We know their system is fundamentally different. We also know that there's a limit to what a Chinese person can protest that is far below what would be allowed in Western democracies. But the point I'm trying to make is that the reason why Chinese people don't care about the lack of freedom and democracy is a lot more complicated than you think, and that it isn't just them being scared or ignorant of their political realities. Social media in China is most definitely closely monitored. The press is also very heavily regulated by the government, and the government can and have exerted much authority that people in the West would never be comfortable with the government exerting. Nobody sane is denying the reality of this. Red line exists in China. Everyone knows that there's a red line that exists in Chinese society that cannot be crossed. including the very people that live in the country. But where exactly does that red line extend to, and how happy is the Chinese people about it? And how much of their freedom and democracy are the Chinese people willing to trade for that stability? That's what is important to understand. China doesn't have the democratic system or the freedom that exists in the West, but understand that the conversation behind China's political system is much more nuanced and complex. A country of 1.4 billion people isn't going to have a homogeneous view of politics, and to assert that they are all brainwashed or ignorant misses the mark completely. Aside from the United States, China is probably the most significant country in the world, yet it is the country that people seem to lack understanding of. So I think it's actually important that we understand how China works and how Chinese people generally think. This means analyzing the situation for what it is and sticking to the truth, and to not fall for the trap of just hand-waving everything with lazy explanations that feel right because it affirms our view of the country. I hope that this video gave you at least a general insight into why a Chinese person might feel a certain way about their government.